Many students struggle with the fundamentals of evolution, but it's not your fault. Core concepts like Hardy Weinberg Equilibrium, the topic of today's video, are usually taught in a way that leaves you with more confusion than appreciation. I'm building an evolution simulator to teach myself JavaScript, but also to create an evolution course. This is the first episode in a series where we cover evolutionary concepts and how we are implementing them into our evolution simulator. In this video, we're going to cover Hardy Weinberg and how we use it to study evolution. Then we are going to cover how we are simulating evolution using a JavaScript app. And lastly, we're going to discuss the goals of this series, including what topics we are covering and what features I am planning on implementing into that evolution simulator. As always, timestamps are below if you want to skip around, but let's hop into it. Let's first start with Hardy Weinberg. So Hardy Weinberg is going to describe populations. Specifically, it describes a hypothetical population where no evolution is occurring. So what do we mean by no evolution? This means that there are no influences from natural selection. So there's no natural selection. There is no gene flow from other populations, so no gene flow. Mating is also completely random. So this means there is no sexual selection. There is no preference for one mate over the other. Mating is completely random within the population. Additionally, we assume that the population is of infinite size. And then lastly, we also assume there is no mutation. So these are the assumptions of Hardy Weinberg, but they are also all evolutionary forces. Now we'll get into the equations P plus Q and P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared in a bit, but I really want to focus on what Hardy Weinberg is describing, because in evolution, when we want to study a population and say, hey, is this population evolving? Is it underneath the influences of natural selection or high gene flow from another population? Or does it have a small size and that is influencing what variables, what alleles are randomly selected from the population? We need to compare that to something. We need to have a control group. We need to have a null hypothesis. Hardy Weinberg is our null hypothesis, right? So if we wrote this out in a different way, remember, we said Hardy Weinberg is where there is no evolution. In science, we do null hypothesis testing, where typically the null is just nothing is going on versus that alternative of something is going on. Hardy Weinberg gives us a null hypothesis for evolutionary studies, where no evolution is occurring in a population. Hardy Weinberg is what we expect to see in a population that is not undergoing evolution. And those expectations are captured in this math here, P plus Q equals 1 and P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. These often confuse people, especially when they're first starting out in their evolutionary biology journey. So let's break this down very simply. And in fact, let's only focus on one. Let's reduce complexity to help us understand the problem better. What is this P plus Q equals 1 describing? We know that in a population, okay, so this is our example population. We know that in the landscape, all of the organisms have genes, and there are different variations of those genes. For example, some people have genes that make red hair, some people have genes that make dark brown hair, right? So those are alleles. Alleles are just different variants of the genes. P and Q are alleles. They are the frequencies of the alleles in the population. So let's say we have this example population here, and we are sampling all of the genetic information from this population. And from here, we find that we have 6 individuals, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that are this red allele, and we find that there are 4 individuals that exhibit this blue allele. we can now fill in P and Q using very basic math, right? So we have 10 total organisms, and we have 6 of them that are red, and we have 4 of them that are blue. All we need to do is divide by 10 the total number of organisms. So if there were 20 organisms, we divide this by 20. And we can now have our basic allele frequencies. This is P and Q. So right here, we have 0.6, 0.6, and I'll try to keep these numbers consistent. And here we have 0.4. Now, whenever we are filling in P and Q, it is standard practice that P is going to be the most common allele. So in this case, we would put in 0.6 here, 0.6. And wouldn't you know it, when we add in Q, 0.4, that totals 1. Boom. And that's because it is always going to represent all of the organisms in the population. But here is a very important question. Assuming this population is under Hardy Weinberg, meaning there is no evolution that is occurring, what do we expect the allele frequency to be for P in the next generation? So again, what will it be in the next generation? So all of these organisms randomly mate. We assume that the population size is infinite here. We just know that it's 60% red and 40% blue. What do we expect the frequency to be in the next generation given the frequencies now? I'll count down from 5. We expect them to be the same. In a population that has no evolution, we would expect the frequencies of the alleles to stay the same. Remember, we have all of these assumptions. How could the allele frequencies change if there is no evolution, right? If there is no natural selection, if there is no gene flow, if everything is mating randomly and the population size is infinitely large and there's no mutations, how would anything change? This is the basis, again, of how we study evolution. So this is what we would expect to see in a population in the next generation if no evolution was occurring. So if we go out and sample a real-world population and we expect to see 60% red and 40% blue, but that next generation we actually see 80% red and 20% blue, that's an indication that evolution is occurring. That's an indication that something is affecting the output that we did not expect. We expected 0.6 and 0.4. Instead, we got 0.8 and 0.2. But we have a longer equation with Hardy Weinberg, and that is P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared. And that also equals 1. So let's go back to that question we asked. What is the probability that an organism will be red or blue? Well, we know that any organism, let's denote an organism with this little circle here. Well, we know this organism, like we said, has a 60% chance of being blue and a 40% chance of being red. But remember, we are typically studying diploid organisms, organisms that have 2 copies of their genes. And these organisms typically mate with one another and their genes combine to form organisms that have homozygous traits. So for example, here it could be P. We could have heterozygous traits, so we could have PQ, or we could have homozygous recessive traits, so QQ. So just remember that organisms can contain different combinations of alleles. And when they mate together, again, they combine their genetic material. So if there is a second organism here, again, what is the probability that an organism has either the blue allele or the red allele? It's again the same as the last one, 0.6 and 0.4. Well, each of these organisms can be represented by P plus Q, correct? P, 0.6 plus Q, 0.4. P plus Q for the other one as well. This equation up here is simply multiplying the probabilities of each individual. How do I know that? if we do the classic FOIL method for math, right? So the FOIL method is front. So we have p squared. All we're going to do is multiply each of these terms. P times p is p squared. We can then do our outer ones. So that would be p and q plus p times q. Then we have our inner. So that's, again, FOIL. So inner is going to be q and p. Again, that is the same as p times q. And then we have our last ones, right? We have q's times q. And that right there, q times q, is going to be q squared. And what we see here is we can simplify this. We can take pq, add those together, and we get p squared plus 2 pq plus q squared. And each of these equals 1, and 1 times 1 is 1. So here we go, equals 1. So again, this equation right here is just the multiplication of the probability for each individual. It's just p plus q times p plus q. That's all this equation is doing. It's a basic FOIL method, but it allows us to see what is the frequency of the genotypes, right? So right here, p squared, that's the frequency of pp. 2pq, that's the frequency of our heterozygotes, right? So that would be pq, or like we already said, we had qp. And then q squared is going to be our qq. And these will add up to 1. Similar to how p plus q equals 1 tells us the expected allele frequencies in the next generation, p squared plus 2pq plus q squared tells us the expected genotype frequencies in the next generation, with those genotypes being homozygous for p, homozygous for q, or the heterozygous that are p and q. Throughout this series, I'll provide examples for what happens when populations deviate from these expectations. But let's focus on how we're actually simulating evolution in our evolution simulator. This is the backend code for the evolution simulator, and at the end of this video, I'm going to cover more about why we're building this simulator and some of the design philosophies. But the way we simulate evolution here is actually pretty simple. The vast majority of this code is actually dependent on this little bit right here. All we're doing is calculating a random value between 0 and 1, and then comparing it to our p-value. But Dylan, it can't be that simple. Evolution is really complex, and that doesn't make sense. How could you just do a simple greater than function? And that's because Hardy Weinberg is simple. P plus q equals 1. And remember, p is the frequency of an allele in a population. So let's say we went out and we measured some population. Instead of, drawing a big population with circles, let's just fill in a very basic bar chart, right? So we have some bar here, and this is going to be a stacked bar chart if you want to get into some data visualization nerding out. But let's say here at the bottom, we have 0, and up here is 100%. And all we're doing is we are calculating p. P is on the y value, right? So in that example population that we had earlier, right? Remember, we had 60% p. So right here, 0.6. 0.6, 60%, however you want to look at it. Okay, now let's shade this in. So remember, all my code is doing is calculating a random number between 0 and 1, between 0% and 100%. And if it is equal to or less than my p-value, it's going to say true. If not, it's going to say false. So what this means is that if my random number generator says, ding, it's true, has a 60% chance of being true, then that individual in the next generation, we're going to say, is going to be p. It's going to be that p allele. But if it dings false, it's going to be q. And that's all we're doing. Now, there's of course much more code than what I'm explaining here, and that's truthfully because I was already working on this simulator, and then I realized I have a failing YouTube career I desperately need to salvage, and this is great content. So I've actually hidden some of the values on this simulator, but we will be covering them in future videos. The next video, we're actually going to cover why we're seeing these deviations and discuss genetic drift. Because right now, remember, we said under Hardy Weinberg, under no evolution, we would expect the population to stay the same. We would expect our value of 0.5 or 0.6 or whatever it was to stay consistent. And that's not what we're seeing here. Additionally, in the code, I've already included a function that will calculate Hardy Weinberg. However, I've also already included the ability to incorporate different selection differentials so that you can simulate natural selection. So that will also be in a future video, probably the one right after the drift one. But finally, I want to actually discuss why I'm building this simulator and what are my goals with it. My first major goal is that I wanted to learn JavaScript. It's been something I've wanted to learn for a very long time, but my biggest reason for creating this is I want to develop an Intro to Evolution course, which covers many of the topics I've already mentioned today. However, I just wasn't impressed with the tools available for people to go and interact and try to understand evolution. I unfortunately found that most tools were either very, very basic, essentially only offering what I already have here, the frequencies of P's, Q's, at the start, number of generations. But I think that there's an opportunity to create an extraordinarily useful teaching tool for evolution and make it freely accessible on my website with a few courses and other resources tied into it. So in the interest of not making this a 35-minute long video of all of the features, I'm just going to paste all of the features I want to have up on the screen right here, and you can pause and read them. I also don't want to spend too much time in these videos talking about the updates just because I know they will drone on. So I'll always be putting them at the ends of the video. And if you want to have more thorough updates or actually use the simulator when it goes live or in my course, you can sign up for the newsletter. I have my link in the bio. So originally, I actually was going to just build this out and then create a course and a series of videos based on this simulator. However, I realized this is content and I didn't want to start filming all of the course material until I have this finished, because I'm going to be sending students there and the design is going to look radically different than what I have now. So I just think making a bunch of lessons that are supposed to last for years, but they are looking at something that, doesn't look like what I'm asking them to interact with, just isn't a great experience. So this is the benefit. YouTube people will get these lessons. These are going to be really informal. They're going to be a little bit more off the cuff, while the lessons that are going to be in the evolution course, probably by next year, they are going to be more concise, including different exercises, activities, quizzes, etc., etc. But with that, this is where I'm going to end the video. Stay tuned for the next one. I'll probably get that drift one out very soon because it's already implemented in this code. But with that, thank you for learning adventurously, and I hope you have a wonderful day. See ya.